Hello and welcome to our daily devotion from Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm Pastor Adam Moline. We've started kind of a new series talking about the different parts of the sanctuary, the things that we see in worship. I almost feel like we should sing that old Sesame Street song, what are the things in your sanctuary? But maybe we won't do that. I'll spare you that. But we're going to continue to talk about some of those things here today. Last time we did talk about the paraments that are in our sanctuary, primarily the different types, the frontals, the superfrontals, the frontlets, the ones that go on the pulpit and the lectern, and primarily we talked a lot about the colors that those paraments are. Now, we also have paraments, or we call them vestments, that a pastor wears, and those oftentimes match the things that are on the altar and on the pulpit and the lectern, and there's a reason for that. So our focus today will be on those particular things. Now, these have been used throughout the history of the church. There's been a little bit of adjustment throughout the centuries, but yet we still are very close to what the very early church and throughout much of the history of the church people have worn. And that's because we do come out of a common tradition. We do come out of the early church. We're standing on the shoulders of those who have gone before us. For that reason, we still do a lot of the same things that we did back in the old days of the church. I know there are some churches today who have kind of stepped away from that, and in a sense it's like standing on the shoulders of someone and then stepping off from where you were before. It kind of does lead to some issues. At the same time, I want to be clear that there's a tremendous amount of freedom in this, and there's not a law about this. We're not wearing these paraments or vestments as if we're earning our way into heaven. We're doing it for good order and to also again teach Jesus crucified and risen, and to hide the man who's doing the teaching, and we'll talk a little bit about that going forward. We mentioned last time that pastors oftentimes wear black. They wear a black clergy shirt, oftentimes with white right up here around the throat, the place where the sound that is produced by our voices is created, indicating that pastors are sinful people just like all of you, and that yet the message we are here to proclaim is the message of hope and life and resurrection, the white color indicated there by that. For the same reason then, if we think about Revelation chapter 7 or even Isaiah's words, the pastor doesn't lead the service wearing black. The pastor usually wears some sort of a white garment over the top of that black shirt to indicate that he has been baptized and clothed in the robe of Christ's righteousness that covers all of his sin, to indicate that he will be resurrected. And in a sense, it's not just the pastor who is going to be resurrected and saved because of Christ that has been baptized. It's also a reminder for all of you. When we are there in heaven standing before Christ, we will all be dressed in the robe of Christ's righteousness. We will all be wearing the white color of resurrection. And so this pastor outfit is also something that could be applied to all of you in that regard as well. The ones that we wear primarily today are what we call albs. Alb is a word that comes from a Latin word, alba, albus, which all it means is that it is white. And it, again, Revelation 7, the white robes of the people standing before Christ in heaven. So the pastor wears an alb, a white robe, to indicate that as well. Now, in the older days, there was a cassock instead of a clergy shirt, which was like a clergy shirt that goes down to your ankles, that's all black, and then over the top of that there would be a white surplice, a similar thing to an alb, but it didn't hang down quite as far. In fact, our acolytes here at Good Shepherds wear surplices when they come up an acolyte, and so that is the same idea. So you can imagine it's just, this is the new model of what has been done throughout the history of the church. Around the alb, pastors wear what is known as a cincture, and cincture is just a fancy word for rope belt. And so pastors wear a cincture around their waist, mostly to keep the alb from blowing away or getting tangled in things as we go about the worship service. When pastors are installed and ordained into the office of the holy ministry, one of the things that we are given are stoles. And we also call this the yoke of our office. Yoke because it goes around our neck and our shoulder like this, the same way that an ox carries a yoke. Now, the stoles are then an indication that we are bearing the yoke of office to proclaim Christ and Him crucified faithfully. And so that way, this is a burden. The office is a burden upon the man who is the pastor, and yet we also have Christ's word that say, take up your cross and follow me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And if a pastor's being faithful to Christ, that is the truth, because the word he preaches is not his own word, it's Christ's word. And then the reaction to that word that comes upon him also is primarily directed at Christ. And so it sets the pastor free, even as he has the burden to preach God's word faithfully and truthfully. Now, the stole is the first part of what we've talked about so far today that does match the color that is on the altar. And this is, in a sense, camouflage for the pastor. The focus of our worship service up here in the front of the sanctuary is not on the man. It is not on the pastor. It's not on Moline. It's not on Poppy. The focus of what happens up here should always be on Jesus. And so the man is covered with things that match what else is up here in the sanctuary, so that you can see I'm just a tool for what God is doing here in the worship service. And we'll see that even more as we get to some of the other liturgical vestments that the pastor wears. And so maybe a way to think about it is when you go deer hunting, bow hunting, you wear camouflage. Or turkey hunting, you wear camouflage so that the animals don't see you, so you can get up closer to them. In the same way, the stoles and the chasubles and the dalmatics are, in a sense, liturgical camouflage so that you can focus on what's important, which is Jesus Christ and Him crucified. So that's the stole. We also, and these are kind of new here at Good Shepherd, although they are old, all the way back to the early days of the church. We have a couple different vestments that we also are wearing now. The first one of them is this, which is called a dalmatic. And you can tell that it's a dalmatic here because you see it has a sleeve, and the sleeve then is sewn here at the bottom. I think our white one is not sewn, it's just open, but because it has a sleeve, we know that it is a dalmatic. This is then contrasted against the other new here at Good Shepherd and yet quite ancient vestment that we're wearing, which is a chasuble, which in a sense it's kind of like what Clint Eastwood wore in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It's open the entire way around with just a hole that the pastor puts his head through, and then it hangs out freely over the top. Now, these two vestments, while they're new here at Good Shepherd, they go back all the way again to the very earliest days of the Christian church. We're standing on their shoulders and we're doing the things that they did so that we don't veer off into new teaching or new ideas. The chasuble, in the ancient world, most everybody wore one of these, but for the worship service specifically, the pastor would wear one that matched the paraments that are up on the altar and the lectern and the pulpit, again, to hide the man and let our focus be on Christ. It also makes us think of the Old Testament time when the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies. He had to be dressed properly to be in the presence of God, not only to hide the man who was doing it from the people's perspective, but also to hide the man's sin from God's perspective so that he could be in the holy place where God was present. And this idea then is brought into our church today as we wear chasubles also, indicating that the focus should not be on the man, the pastor, but rather on Christ. And also again indicating that the sin of the pastor, because pastors are sinful, is covered by Jesus, thereby allowing him to be up here and handle the holy things of God, primarily the Lord's Supper, the body and blood of Jesus, as we could talk about baptism a little bit in that regard as well. The chasuble is, again, that idea, and it covers up and it indicates that the person wearing the chasuble is there to say the verba, the Lord's words, the institution of the Lord's Supper, whereas the dalmatic is worn by the person who is the assistant for that particular service, the one who's assisting the person who is performing the Lord's Supper at that particular service. There also is another vestment. We don't have one here at Good Shepherd, but it's called a cope. It's a cape, if you will. It hangs primarily around the back and is open in the front, and that is worn primarily by ecclesiastical supervisors, just one more level of indicating their position in the church. So the dalmatic, the chasuble, and the cope, while they hide the man and they match up here to blend the man into the front of the sanctuary, all they indicate for us also is what each person is doing in the worship service. The dalmatic is the assistant's outfit, the chasuble is the celebrant's outfit, and the cope would be the ecclesiastical supervisor's outfit. And all of these things then just kind of tell us who's doing what and what's going to happen in the worship service, so that when we watch the worship service, we don't have to think and ask those questions. It's all been shown to us in the outfits worn, so that again our focus can be primarily and completely on Jesus. Now, these outfits that we have shown you, the albs, the cassocks and surplices, the chasuble, the stole, the dalmatics, have been worn almost throughout the entire history of the Christian church. Even Martin Luther, we have paintings of him wearing chasubles, distributing the Lord's Supper. Some very famous paintings, in fact, that indicate that this is what the Lutherans wore during the time of the Reformation as well. It is not a law. It is not saving us by doing this. It is done out of freedom and good order so that we might proclaim Christ and let Christ predominate. There is a little bit of a history in the Lutheran Church as well of wearing a preaching robe, a primarily black robe. This comes about in the 1700s and 1800s, primarily out of something called rationalism, where the focus of what was being preached and taught was really no longer about Christ, but instead was more of an academic sort of endeavor. Preaching sometimes at that time was about how to plant potatoes and raise them properly so that you can provide for your family. And when preaching became more academic, the robe switched to that black academic Geneva-style robe. We don't wear those often here at Good Shepherd for that very reason. Our preaching is not academic. It's not about how to live your life. We do have that obviously in the sermons, but it's not our primary focus. Our primary focus is on Jesus. Thus, the black is covered by the white alb, and the vestments blend us in here up to the front of the sanctuary so that everything we do, everything we say, can hopefully draw your attention to Jesus. The chasuble and the cope and all those things then do match whatever color is on the altar for that particular day, as it continues to also bring those ideas of what we talked about last week to your mind as well. Again, with all of these particular video devotions, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me or call Pastor Poppy. We're happy to talk about them. We're happy to answer any questions or to have a conversation about it. These things are not laws and rules. They're things we do freely to try and help keep your focus and our focus as pastors on Jesus Christ crucified and risen. God's blessings on your day.